Picture the last time you drove the Hutch, or I-95 through Port Chester. You probably weren't thinking about the law, but the law was thinking about you. New York is now likely the single most expensive state in the country for car insurance. The average policy has crossed $4,000 a year, 60% of the national average. The reason isn't that Westchester residents are bad drivers. The reasons, critics argue, is a personal injury system that has become a machine for generating fees rather than justice. In 2025 alone, trial lawyers spent nearly $179 million on legal advertising across New York, an 84% increase in 2 years. Those are the billboards. And Governor Hochul has made reforming this system the defining legislative fight in 2026. Lauren Zelt runs PACT, Protecting Americans' Consumers Together, a national organization that launched last year with a $10 million campaign to do exactly that. She's a former U.S. Senate staffer, a veteran public affairs operator, and one of the Business Insider's 20 female political strategists to watch. She can explain how this system works and who it actually serves and what needs to change. Lauren, so nice to meet you, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me on the show.
So you've spent years in public affairs, and you ran your own firm before really taking on this role. What was the moment that convinced you that personal injury system specifically was the right fight that needed to happen?
So most Americans in this day and age are focused on the issue of affordability. And I started to see that the issue of lawsuit abuse reform could really have lasting impacts on consumers' bottom line and their family budgets. And I really like tackling issues that are easily translatable to everyday Americans. I started my career as a TV producer, and I like telling stories. And so the story of lawsuit abuse reform, the story of putting more money back into consumers' pockets is a good one, and it's working in some states across the country. So I thought it would be a great fight for me to engage in.
So PACT launched just over a year ago with a $10 million national campaign. For someone hearing about this for the first time, what would you say is the core problem that you're trying to solve?
Sure. So we're basically doing two things. We're working to protect consumers by lowering costs for advocating for transparent access to the justice system for all. Okay. So in certain states like New York, consumers are facing high costs due to lawsuit abuse. But at the same time, those who utilize the justice system via a billboard attorney are being taken advantage of. And so PACT was formed to help address both issues. We want to make sure that people can access the justice system and that they can do so safely in a way that doesn't raise costs for their friends and neighbors.
I love the term billboard attorneys. You spend any time on 95 down in Florida, it's just like bang, 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 one after the next. And most people picture the ads. I watch, News 4 in the morning, and I could probably rattle off 3 or 4 law firms. But, I think what you're arguing here is something more harmful underneath the advertising. So perhaps you can kind of walk me through the actual mechanics. How does someone who's generally injured end up in a worse position after working with one of these billboard firms?
Sure. So it unfortunately is a really prevalent system that we see in many states across the country, and New York is no exception to that. So the first thing that happens is billboard attorneys will often find ways to reach out to potential clients via a cold call. In many instances and in many jurisdictions and states, that's actually illegal. So the first thing to know for your listeners is if they unfortunately find themselves in an accident, if they do receive a cold call from an attorney, it's probably not an attorney that they want to hire. But during these cold calls, people are often promised free services. They're promised large settlements. They're promised financial benefit while the case goes on. And that's kind of the second warning sign is the free services and financial benefits, because what that usually means is that the attorney is going to persuade the client to enter into a high interest lien agreement, sort of on par with payday loans, that have astronomical interest rates and are really, really difficult for the clients and for those seeking the justice system to pay back after the eventual settlement, if they get one. And so that's kind of the second warning sign is if you're being asked to sign a lot of papers and you don't really understand the terms of any kind of lien agreement or loan agreement, you'll want to make sure to review that very carefully to make sure that you're not entering into something that's predatory. Another way in which this happens is billboard attorneys will often advise their clients to seek medical treatment that is unnecessary. And in some cases leaves the individuals in worse shape than they were before they started the procedure. The billboard attorneys do this because it helps them inflate the amount of the eventual settlement, which in turn ups their payday, but doesn't necessarily up the amount that the person gets at the end of the day. And so when juries are considering the medical costs built in a way that exists like a state in New York, unfortunately, people can be pressured into these medical procedures that they don't need because they're told that they're going to get a large payday at the end of it, which doesn't always happen. So that's kind of how it works. New York has a particularly high incidence as well of staged accidents. So these are people that are knowingly and willfully entering into fraudulent practices in order to get fraudulent settlements. So that's kind of a whole separate issue that we're tracking as well. Because that's really what raises the cost for consumers.
Now, there's a concept called third-party litigation funding. And this is where outside investors essentially bankroll lawsuits in exchange for a cut of the settlement.
Right.
How does that dynamic change the incentives in the room? And what does that mean for the person whose name is on the case?
Sure. So there are many different types of third-party litigation funding agreements, including there are some investments by foreign entities, which we find to be concerning. But the most egregious form of third-party litigation finance are loan agreements that the billboard attorneys often recommend to your clients. So these are the ones that are problematic. They often include predatory terms that can be compared to payday loans. And in some cases, these agreements financially benefit the attorney themselves. Because what's known as common ownership agreements. So if the attorney benefits financially because you're signing up for a predatory loan, something is wrong. And that practice is what PACT is really, really concerned about for consumers.
New York is right in the middle of a live debate on this. Governor Hochul has proposed sweeping tort reform in the 2026 budget. I've probably been hearing about tort reform for over 50 years at this point. But, the trial lawyers' lobby is pushing back hard. Where is the fight right now, and what does that mean for New Yorkers if this reform stalls?
Yeah, so I think that the trial lawyers lobby is concerned that people are starting to understand the connection between the high costs that they face and the instances of lawsuit abuse that are playing out in our communities. PACT is working to help New Yorkers understand that the choice really here is simple: rein in lawsuit abuse and lower costs for everyone, or continue to allow the Empire State to be home to high incidences of staged accidents and face high insurance rate. It's really one or the other. If reform doesn't pass, rates will only continue to climb and families will continue to suffer, unfortunately.
Now, Westchester residents are paying some of the highest auto insurance premiums in the country. And there's a direct line between legal practices you're describing and those rates. Help me draw that line for someone who doesn't really see the connection yet.
Sure. So the biggest thing to understand is how the staged accidents are contributing to these rates. So Governor Hochul has pointed this out, but New York is home to some of the highest incidents of staged accidents in the country. We have increasingly sophisticated actors working to stage accidents designed to allow for jackpot payouts from insurance company or jury awards. And these scams are becoming more prevalent. I think there were 29 incidences of staged accidents in New York State in 2023, which New York State ranks as the second highest state in the nation for fraud. The insurance companies reported for over 43,000 incidents of suspected motor vehicle insurance fraud in New York State in 2025. And that's up from about 25,000 incidences of motor vehicle insurance fraud in 2020, an 80% increase. So, what the proposal, as I understand it, is trying to do is really crack down on these staged accidents and make sure that insurance fraud is not so easily obtainable in New York State so that rates can go down for everyone.
So here's a challenge I want to put to you directly. Critics of the reform movement, including some consumer advocates, they're arguing that this whole conversation is driven by insurance money and that the real goal is to limit the rights of people who are genuinely and seriously injured. How do you respond to that?
Sure. The response is very important to that. PACT is committed to ensuring that all Americans are safely able to access the justice system. Full stop. What we're focused on is protecting consumers from the predatory practices of billboard attorneys that, as we've discussed, often leave clients in more debt and in more pain than they were before they engaged the attorney.
So PACT, operates nationally, but legal reform happens state by state. Florida and Louisiana have both passed meaningful reforms, but New York hasn't. So what's different about New York, and is there a realistic path to change here?
I do think there's a realistic path to change in New York. One thing that PACT has learned since we've been in operation is that leadership at the executive level is really, really important on passing lawsuit abuse reform. So we see Governor Hochul consistently highlighting the problems that consumers face because of things like stage accidents. So we see her demonstrating leadership on the issue. So that's important. But we have been focused our efforts on showing New Yorkers two things. First, the dangers of working with a billboard attorney. And second, the benefits that reform has allowed for consumers, especially financially. So I'll give your listeners an example. In Florida, where they passed reform in 2023, 80% of auto insurers lowered the rates by an average of 8% for their customers after reform. So that's 80% of the market, 8% reduction, pretty much standard. But a lot of consumers are seeing much more than that. I can tell you that my own personal car insurance, I reside in the state of Florida, and my own car insurance went down 25%. And I was one of the customers that received a rebate from Progressive when they announced that they were going to do, I think it was $1 billion rebate earlier this year. So it is working in other states. We saw Georgia pass reform in 2025. I believe State Farm has already announced a 10% rate reduction there. So we have very clear and concrete examples to point to. It's not going to be overnight. It's going to take, a little bit of time, but the results have been really, really impactful for consumers in other states. And that's what we're hoping will happen in New York.
If a Westchester resident gets into an accident tomorrow, or a real one, real injuries, what should they actually know before they call any number they see on a billboard, or frankly, how do they even find a good attorney?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm glad that you asked it because it's very important for your listeners to understand. So first, we want to discuss and remember the warning signs that I talked about earlier. So if an attorney cold calls you, it's probably that, likely that you don't want to work with that attorney. I also really recommend that your listeners check out Yelp reviews for law firms and other online reviews that are available. You would be shocked at some of the things that you'll find in Yelp reviews for attorneys that have very common names and very common practices across the state. So Yelp reviews are your friends. And then just do as much research as you can on a law firm. You could even ask if they have anyone that you could talk to that's been, happy with their services, things like that. You'll never know unless you ask. And the more questions that you ask, the better off that you'll be.
Well, Lauren, I would like a 10% reduction in my car insurance. And
yeah,
I am here in New York, so get this done, would you? What are you talking to me for?
No, it's very important that your listeners understand this issue and that they know that they know what their legislators are working on. It's great.
Lauren, thank you so much for sharing this information. So many things just happen and we never even know, and we just open up the bills and go, what the heck happened here? So this is something, like I said, it's been talked about for many, many, many years in terms of tort reform, and maybe sometime we'll see something happen in the near future. But I want to thank you, and thank you for the good advice for Westchester.
Thank you so much. It was great to be here.